Escape to Freedom by Ruth Fosdick Jones. Chapter 10. I hear we're going fishing. For a few minutes, nobody said anything. Sam stared into the fire while the Blaines absorbed the impact of his story. Timothy found himself watching the play of flickering lights over the big man's face, noticing how it accentuated the hollows in his gaunt cheeks and made caverns of shadow around his deep-set eyes. It was Mrs. Blaine who broke the spell of their silence. She rose and went into the pantry, returning with a plate of fresh fried cakes and a stone jug of sweet cider that her husband had somehow come by in the course of the afternoon. John Blaine cleared his throat and reached for a fried cake. I think, Sam, he said, that you will have to lie low for a few days. I should like to put you across the river immediately, but that fracas is in the stage yard focused too much attention upon you for me to risk it now. You almost certainly would be taken, and none of us wishes to see you returned to the uncertain kindness of your master. Certain unkindnesses would be a better way of putting it, muttered Mary Blaine as she plied her knitting needles. Her husband smiled at her and went on. Besides, I don't particularly care for the interest that both the marshal's deputies and your master have shown in this household. I think that when Colonel Morgan called this afternoon, Mrs. Blaine and Timothy succeeded in putting him off, and he smiled, although Dora did not help them very much. But he is smart enough to see that the only contact you could have made aside from the people on the hotel premises was with either Timothy or me. I don't believe he will forget us, and he may keep an eye on us as a precaution. And the marshal's office may too. So we shall just have to do nothing for a few days, perhaps even a week. But if all goes well, we shall plan your crossing for next Friday night. How long is it, he asked, turning to Timothy, since we have been fishing together? Not since I broke my arm, father, answered the boy promptly. Well then, we certainly shall go once more before winter sets in, pronounced Mr. Blaine briskly. Now let me see, he mused, leaning back in his chair and staring at the smoothly plastered ceiling. How shall we arrange this? He sat in deep thought while the others consumed their cider and fried cakes. We might do it this way, he said slowly after a few minutes, thinking as he talked. We might go fishing next Friday night, provided it doesn't rain. That would be a good night to go. For the moon will be new, a good dark night. So far, so good. But if we do that, we are going to need reinforcements. If Mr. Dunning would go and take Jake, he stopped and shook his head. No, that won't do. We'd have some left over. What do you mean, John? Asked Timothy's mother. What I am trying to arrange, explained John Blaine, is a fishing party of 4. Mr. Dunning, the 2 boys, and myself. But even after almost a week, there still will be someone on the lookout for Sam. So I have to get Sam from here to Black Rock Harbor invisibly. No one must see him at all. Couldn't Sam hide in the back of the wagon just as he did when I brought him here from the market? Asked Timothy. Yes, he could. That would serve well enough as far as Black Rock, because he could hide in the wagon before we took it out of the shed. But it does not help us with the watchers on the shore. I know that the shore will be watched, and a $2,000 reward is a great help to a man's eyesight, even on a dark night. I don't want any marshal's deputy to start counting noses and saying to himself, there's John Blaine and the Reverend Mr. Dunning and their 2 boys, but who is the other man? Well then, said Mary Blaine calmly, Sam will have to take Mr. Dunning's place. What do you mean, Mary? Asked her husband. It shouldn't be hard, really, explained Mr. Blaine. They are about the same build. Sam can wear Mr. Dunning's clothes, especially that disreputable old hat he wears fishing. Anybody who happens to see you start out would be positive that Mr. Dunning was in our wagon, just from the sight of that hat. But you will have to persuade him to lend Jake to you as well as the hat, she laughed. I think I can do that, said John Blaine. But aren't you leaving me rather short-handed on oarsmen? Sam can't row with his wounded arm, and although you have solved the problem at the Black Rock end, you have created one here. Jake and I can each take an oar, burst in Timothy. Together we can pull as hard as a man, or even harder. His father smiled. I was not doubting your strength, son, he said. I was just questioning your endurance. You haven't done much rowing since you broke your arm. But I've chopped wood, and if I can do that, I can row a boat, argued the boy. What problem have I created? Interposed Mary Blaine. If Mr. Dunning is not going fishing, my dear, answered her husband, how do we get a man clothed like Mr. Dunning to walk over here with Jake, or to walk from his front door to our wagon with Jake, whichever proves to be the more practical course? Mr. Dunning will walk over here with Jake, answered Mary Blaine promptly. He'll have to. When he gets here, he can change clothes with Sam, and you can go off about your business. And how will he get home? Asked John Blaine, eyebrows raised. His wife broke into laughter. I'm afraid, John, that he will have to return home over the back fences. There is no other way. His father chuckled, and Timothy laughed outright, visited by a mental picture of the Reverend Mr. Dunning's solemn face with its close-trimmed chin whiskers and round, steel-rimmed glasses. He was good company and an avid fisherman, but he imparted dignity even to catching the perch, and it was impossible to imagine him vaulting fences with coattails flying. You underestimate our parson, Mary, Mr. Blaine reproved her. He would be willing to sacrifice his dignity to a good cause. Anyway, he continued, we shall plan along those lines. He turned to Sam. Actually, you will have to do the hardest part, for you will have nothing at all to do for almost a week. You can't even curry my horse, for I am not going to have that sharp-eyed master of yours poking around here asking more questions. He stopped suddenly, and his eyes lighted up. Unless, he said slowly, you would like to help me make an addition to our cellar. Mary Blaine laid down her knitting. An addition to the cellar? She asked incredulously. Her husband nodded. Come cold weather, it is most uncomfortable for our guests in the shed, and we have no safe place to keep them in the house. So, explained John Blaine, I thought I would make one. If I remove 2 or 3 of those wide boards from the wall of your store closet and knocked out part of the cellar wall behind them, a room could be dug out there. It could be heated with a stove by running a pipe into the cellar flue of the kitchen chimney. We never use that old oven that it serves. It suddenly came to me that even with one hand, Sam could use a trowel. In that way, he could keep out of sight, but have something to occupy him, and at the same time, help me and those who follow him. I'd like to do that, Mr. Blaine, Sam assured him earnestly. I'm not used to idling, and if there's anything I can do to help other folks like you've helped me, that's what I want to do. And I, said Mary Blaine, rolling up her knitting, We'll give you 3 good meals a day to put strength into you so that when you get to Canada, you can start working right away to get Georgie back. Meanwhile, don't forget, John Blaine warned them, that we may be watched. Sam, you must keep out of sight. And you, Mary and Tim, must act as though nothing unusual had happened to you in all your lives and never would. It was very difficult, Timothy found in the days that followed, to do nothing that might seem unusual or worthy of investigation to anyone who might be suspicious of him. It was easy enough in school. There he could relax and be himself. But the moment he stepped out of the school door, self-consciousness settled down upon him. He worried so much that something he might do would endanger Sam that he considered his every move before he made it. It would be easier all around, he thought, if he played sick and stayed in bed until it was time to take Sam to Black Rock. But he knew that he could not suffer from illness all week and then suddenly recover in time to go fishing on Friday night. That certainly would arouse anyone's suspicions, and in any case, Timothy knew that his mother would never allow him to do it. On Wednesday, as he and Jake charged up Pearl Street after school, a smart rig passed them, pulled by a high-stepping black horse. Timothy recognized Colonel Morgan driving. The Southerner glanced sharply at the boys and then touched the brim of his hat as he recognized Timothy. Timothy tugged at the visor of his cap by way of returning greeting and resisted an impulse to increase his pace in order to put as much distance as possible between himself and the slave owner. "Who's that?" asked Jake curiously. "The master of the slave that escaped down by the stage yard the other morning," answered Timothy briefly. Picking up a stick from the sidewalk, he threw it into the branches of the horse chestnut overhead in an effort to dislodge some of its weight of satiny polished nuts. His aim was good, and in scrambling after this October wealth, the slave owner was forgotten. But the next morning, he was in both boys' minds before they had reached the end of Jake's front walk. "I hear we're going fishing tomorrow night," said Jake, and the way he said fishing made it sound as though it had quotation marks around it. He gave Timothy a conspirator's smile to let him know that his father had told him about the plan. But Timothy felt no answering thrill of excitement over what they were about to do. After having heard Sam's story, he felt only a tremendous urge to get him safely across the river. It would be, he thought, the most important thing he had ever done. Perhaps what Sam was doing in the cellar brought home his position to Timothy even more strongly. Day by day, the hole that Sam was digging grew larger, and every evening the boy helped him spread the dirt he had removed from beyond the cellar wall on the hard-packed earth of the floor and trample it down. Before winter came to stay, the passengers in this particular underground railroad station would have a snug and comfortable waiting room. By Friday, Timothy was in such a state of inner turmoil that he could not keep his mind on his schoolwork. His thoughts kept wandering away along nightmare paths of mischance and danger, all leading to Sam's capture. So steeped in anxiety was he that he made 7 mistakes on his arithmetic paper and had to stay after school. The October afternoon was graying into darkness when he closed the school door behind him. He shivered in his light jacket as he ran homeward, for the weather had turned cold. When he reached home, there was no time for anything except splitting the kindling, and before he could finish that task, his mother was calling him to an early supper. Timothy dumped the wood noisily into the woodbox and blew on his fingers to warm them. Playfully, he laid one of his cold hands on the back of his mother's neck. She screamed satisfactorily. "Mercy, Tim," she cried. "Is it as cold as that outside? You and your father will have to wear your heavy clothes tonight. While you wash up, I'll just get them out of the chest for you." She whisked out into the hall and was back in a moment with their heavy coats, woolen mufflers, Timothy's gray mittens, and the heavy gauntlets she had hooked for her husband. Into these, between the designs at the tips and the bands on the cuffs, she had worked his initials, J.B. Supper was a rather silent meal. The whole family had grown fond of the big patient man they had rescued, and he of them. The things they all wanted to say on their last night together were too deep for speech. It is hard to put gratitude or one's prayers for a man's future into words. Only Dora chattered happily. It had been impossible to keep Sam's presence from her, so Mary Blaine had allowed the little girl to tag after him. The Blaines saw that the man's gentleness extended not only to helpless animals, but to little children as well. Now, Dora understood that her friend Sam was going away, but she was cheerful about it. "You come again, Sam?" Sam smiled down at her. "I most certainly will if I can, honey," he promised. "And bring Georgie?" persisted Dora, for she had heard about Sam's son in the hours she had sat on the cellar stairs and kept the man company while he worked. Sam nodded soberly. "Yes, Miss Dora," he said firmly. "I think I'll be able to do that, too, some day." "You must let us know if there's anything we can do to help." "Anything," broke in Mary Blaine. "And please let us know where you are." Her voice trailed off helplessly. There was so much that she would want to know about Sam and Georgie and their future. "I surely will, ma'am," Sam promised. "You know," he went on, "the Bennetts down in Savannah gave me hope again, and now you folks are giving me freedom. I knew there were good white folks as well as bad ones, but I never thought they'd be so kind to me. I'm better off than most of my people, but I'm still just a slave." The knocker sounded, and John Blaine rose from the table. "Sam," he said as he went to let in Jake and his father, "I predict that in less than 2 hours you will never again have to call yourself a slave. You will be a free man."